What if I told you that the Liberty Bell cracked the very first time someone rang it? That George Washington never wore a wig, just powdered his own hair white every single morning, and that Abraham Lincoln is in the Wrestling Hall of Fame with only one recorded loss in 300 matches? American history isn't just presidents and wars and textbook dates. It's weird. It's funny. It's full of moments that nobody bothered to mention in school because they were too busy making you memorize the year the Compromise of 1850 happened. So here's what we're doing tonight. Over the next 2 hours, I'm going to walk you through 100 rare facts about US history, the strange ones, the ironic ones, the ones that make you think, wait, really? Before we start, if you enjoy falling asleep to oddly specific historical trivia narrated by someone who sounds perpetually exhausted, consider subscribing. Hit the like button if you're still conscious enough to find it. And if you actually make it through all 100 facts without falling asleep, congratulations, you have insomnia. Welcome to the club. Let's begin at the beginning with a flag that wasn't quite what we thought it was. The Circle of Stars. Let's start at the beginning with the flag. You know the one. 13 stripes, 13 stars, very patriotic, very rectangular. But here's the thing about that first flag from 1777. Those 13 stars were arranged in a circle. Not rows, not a constellation pattern, but a perfect circle, like they were having a meeting. And you've probably heard the story about Betsy Ross sewing it in her Philadelphia upholstery shop, right? George Washington himself supposedly walking in and asking for a flag. Well, that's a lovely story. Her grandson told it at a historical society meeting in 1870. But there's no primary source proof, no letters, no receipts, no journal entries, just a family story told a century later. Which doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it does mean we can't be sure. History is tricky like that. And speaking of things we thought we knew about the founding fathers, Washington's real hair. George Washington, first president, father of our country, guy on the dollar bill. And for some reason, we've all been walking around thinking he wore a wig. You've seen the paintings, that white, powdery, very 18th century hairstyle. Looks like a wig, right? Except it wasn't. It was his actual hair. Naturally reddish brown, which he powdered white because that was the fashion, and George Washington was nothing if not fashionable. He'd pull it back, tie it in a queue, dust it with powder, and call it a day. No horsehair, no synthetic fibers, just his own follicles doing their best. Which somehow makes it weirder, honestly. The man had enough hair to style like that every single day. Meanwhile, half the population today can't even grow a decent ponytail. But at least Washington was honest about his hair situation, unlike some other aspects of early American history. The bell that couldn't. The Liberty Bell. Icon of freedom. Symbol of independence. Cracked beyond repair. And you might think it cracked after years of noble service, ringing out the news of American liberty across Philadelphia. But no. It cracked the first time they tested it. 1752. Fresh from the London foundry, shipped across the Atlantic, installed in the Pennsylvania State House, and they gave it one good ring to see how it sounded. And it cracked. Just split right down the side like a disappointment. They had to melt it down and recast it twice before they got one that worked. And even that one eventually cracked again in 1846, which is when they just gave up and let it be broken. So the Liberty Bell has essentially been dealing with performance anxiety since day one. A very relatable American origin story, if you think about it. But while bells were failing in Philadelphia, Jefferson's spinning solution. Thomas Jefferson was sitting in his room in 1776, probably exhausted, definitely overthinking every word of the Declaration of Independence, when he apparently decided he needed to be able to spin. Not like dancing, though that would be great, but rotating in his chair. So he invented the swivel chair. Just took a Windsor chair and mounted it on a spindle so he could turn to face different tables, different windows, different angles of natural light. Peak efficiency, peak overthinking, very Thomas Jefferson. And you have to wonder if he was spinning in that chair when he wrote, "All men are created equal," while enslaving over 600 people in his lifetime. The irony is dizzying. Literally, if you spin too much. But that chair survives today, by the way, in the Smithsonian, a monument to invention and contradiction. And speaking of names that stuck around, what's in a name? The White House. Seems obvious, right? Big white building, house for the president, White House. But it wasn't always called that. When John Adams moved in back in 1800, before it was even finished, because deadlines are a myth, they called it the President's Palace, or the President's House, or the Executive Mansion if you were feeling fancy. But Dolly Madison, wife of James Madison, fourth president, absolute social powerhouse, started calling it the White House during the War of 1812, and the name just stuck. Officially, though, it wasn't the White House until Theodore Roosevelt put it on his stationery in 1901. So for over a century, it was the White House in spirit, but not in paperwork. Very bureaucratic, very American. But before the White House had its name, before any of this, there were warnings in the night. Revere's actual words: Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, April 18th, 1775. One if by land, two if by sea. The whole thing immortalized by Longfellow's poem a century later. But here's what Revere didn't do. Shout, "The British are coming," through the streets of Massachusetts like some kind of colonial alarm system. First of all, everyone in Massachusetts was British at that point. Technically, they were all British subjects, so that warning would have been confusing at best. What Revere actually said, according to his own account, was, "The regulars are out," meaning the British regular army troops. Much more specific, much less poetic. And honestly, he didn't even finish the ride. He got captured in Lexington, lost his horse, and walked back. So the midnight ride was more like the midnight ride until capture and then awkward walk home. History is rarely as clean as poetry makes it sound, but at least some historical events were quick. The 100-Day War, the Spanish-American War, 1898. You might not remember much about it from history class because it was incredibly short. 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days to be exact. That's shorter than a summer vacation, shorter than most TV show seasons. The U.S. declared war on Spain in April over Cuban independence, and the sinking of the USS Maine fought in Cuba and the Philippines, and by August it was over. Spain surrendered. America got Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and suddenly became a colonial power, which was a whole new identity crisis for a country that had fought against colonialism a century earlier. But the war itself? Blink and you'd miss it. Well, not if you were actually fighting in it, obviously. That would be terrifying. But historically speaking, it was practically a long weekend. And speaking of quick decisions with long consequences, Seward's gamble. 1867. William Seward, Secretary of State under Andrew Johnson, bought Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. That's about 7,200,000 acres. Do the math, and it comes out to roughly 2 cents per acre. An absolute steal. Except nobody in America thought so at the time. They called it Seward's Folly. Seward's Icebox. Why would we need Alaska? It's just ice and bears and probably some angry moose. But Seward knew something about geography and potential and getting deals while they lasted. Russia wanted to sell, America bought, and decades later we found gold and oil and strategic military positioning. So Seward's Folly turned into Seward's genius posthumously, which is how a lot of genius works, honestly. You make the right call, everyone thinks you're ridiculous, and 50 years later, they name schools after you. But while we're talking about misunderstood gifts, Liberty's full name, the Statue of Liberty, she stands in New York Harbor, all 305 feet of her, if you count the foundation, holding a torch, wearing a crown, welcoming the tired and poor and huddled masses. But her real name isn't the Statue of Liberty. It's Liberty Enlightening the World, which is more ambitious, honestly, more philosophical. The French gave her to America in 1886 as a gift, celebrating the alliance during the American Revolution and shared values of freedom. And she was supposed to be a lighthouse. That torch was meant to be functional, but it turned out she wasn't bright enough for that job. The torch, I mean, not liberty itself, though that's debatable. So she just became symbolic instead, which is probably more important anyway. You can't navigate ships by symbolism, but you can build a national identity around it. And speaking of unexpected national icons, Lincoln the wrestler, Abraham Lincoln, 16th president, saved the Union, delivered the Gettysburg Address. Also, apparently threw down in wrestling matches across Illinois in his youth. And he was good, very good. Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches tall, lean, strong from years of manual labor, and he reportedly had a record of around 300 wins and only one documented loss. That's practically undefeated. He's in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame because of it. The Illinois wrestling community does not forget, and there's something deeply funny about Honest Abe out there, in his 20s, grappling people in the dirt, talking trash, and winning match after match. It humanizes him, reminds you that before he was the mythological figure in the memorial, he was just a tall guy who could pin you in under a minute. History is so much stranger than Marble makes it look. But wrestling aside, Lincoln's presidency began with literal fire. The first shot, 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Civil War technically started when Confederate forces opened fire on the federal fort, but we know who fired the first shot: Edmund Ruffin, a 67-year-old Virginia farmer, pro-slavery advocate, and general agitator who had been given the honor of pulling the lanyard on a cannon. So, the deadliest war in American history, over 600,000 deaths, started with an elderly man and a symbolic cannon shot at dawn. Ruffin would later take his own life in 1865 after the Confederacy's defeat, unable to live in a reunited nation. The first shot and the final tragedy, both connected by one man's commitment to a cause. The Civil War is full of details like that, personal, painful, and impossible to forget. And speaking of personal connections to history, Lee's wife's lineage. Robert E. Lee, Confederate general, complicated historical figure, guy who chose Virginia over the Union. But here's something you might not know. His wife, Mary Custis Lee, was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, which means the commander of the Confederate Army was related by marriage to the First Lady. The Arlington estate where the Lees lived, now Arlington National Cemetery, was originally the Custis family plantation, built with enslaved labor on a hill overlooking Washington, D.C. So, when Lee chose to lead Confederate forces, he was fighting against the government that George Washington helped create on land connected to Washington's family. History loves irony like this, loves tangling family trees and political choices into impossible knots. It's almost poetic, except poetry usually has better outcomes. But while we're discussing what the Civil War did and didn't accomplish, the proclamation's limits, the Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st, 1863. Abraham Lincoln declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. And that's how it's taught usually. Lincoln freed the slaves. End of story. Except it wasn't all enslaved people. just the ones in areas still in rebellion. Border states loyal to the Union, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, still had slavery, and those enslaved people weren't freed by the proclamation. Because Lincoln didn't think he had the legal authority to free them, and also he didn't want to upset those border states and push them toward the Confederacy. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a military strategy as much as a moral one. It didn't fully end slavery. That took the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. History is rarely as clean as we'd like it to be, but at least some historical changes were straightforward, like taxation. The first income tax, 1861. The Civil War was expensive. Soldiers needed salaries, supplies, weapons, all of it. So Congress passed the Revenue Act, which included a tax on personal income, 3% on incomes over $800, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that $800 in 1861 is like $25,000 today. So most people didn't pay it, but it was there. America's first income tax, created out of wartime desperation. It was repealed in 1872 once the war debt was paid off, because the idea of taxing income felt radical and potentially unconstitutional. Then in 1894, they tried again. That one got struck down by the Supreme Court. Finally, in 1913, the 16th Amendment made income tax permanent. And here we are today, still filing forms every April and wondering where it all went wrong. But before the government was taxing income, it was funding faster communication. The express that couldn't, the Pony Express. Romantic, daring. Young men on fast horses carrying mail across the frontier from Missouri to California in just 10 days. It launched in April of 1860, and everyone thought it was the future of communication. Except it wasn't. It lasted exactly 18 months. October 1861, the transcontinental telegraph was completed, and suddenly you could send messages across the country in seconds instead of days. So the Pony Express went bankrupt almost immediately. All that mythology, the riders, the speed, the danger, compressed into a year and a half. Buffalo Bill Cody rode for the Pony Express. So did a bunch of teenagers making $1 a day, risking their lives. And then it was over, obsolete, replaced by wires and electricity. Sometimes history moves faster than the horses. But the telegraph wasn't the only thing connecting the country. The railroad's real finish line, the Transcontinental Railroad, the great American infrastructure project of the 1860s. Two companies building track from opposite directions, Central Pacific from California, Union Pacific from Nebraska, meeting somewhere in the middle to connect the coasts. And everyone assumes they met in California, right? Because California is the western endpoint, except they didn't. They met at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory on May 10th, 1869. Not California. Utah. Middle of nowhere, honestly. Just a flat stretch of land where the two lines could finally connect. They drove in ceremonial spikes, took photographs, broke champagne bottles, and congratulated each other on shrinking the country. 6 days of travel time from coast to coast instead of months. Progress built on the backs of thousands of laborers, many of them Chinese immigrants whose names we don't even know. But about those ceremonial spikes. The golden spike that wasn't Promontory Summit, May 10th, 1869. The ceremonial completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And they had a golden spike for the occasion, 17.6 carats, engraved with names and dates, very fancy, plus a few other ceremonial spikes from different states and companies. But here's the thing, none of those were the actual final spike. The last spike driven into the rail to complete the railroad was just a regular iron one. Because you can't leave gold lying around in the middle of Utah. Someone would steal it. So they drove in the regular spike, posed for photos with the golden one, then took all the ceremonial spikes home as souvenirs. The golden spike is now in a museum at Stanford University. The iron one is anonymous, lost to history, but it's the one that actually mattered. Very American. Celebrate with gold, build with iron. But while railroads were transforming transportation, Twain's perfect name, the Gilded Age, post-Civil War America, roughly 1870 to 1900, industrialization, urbanization, massive wealth inequality, robber barons, political corruption, all wrapped in a thin layer of prosperity and optimism. And the name came from Mark Twain. He wrote a novel called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, in 1873 with Charles Dudley Warner, satirizing the era's greed and superficiality. Gilded, not golden, just gold-plated. Shiny on the surface, cheap underneath. The name stuck because it was perfect. It captured the contradiction. Progress and poverty, innovation and exploitation, all happening at once. Twain had a gift for naming things, probably because he renamed himself, born Samuel Clemens, rewrote his identity as Mark Twain, and then rewrote American literature while he was at it. Some people just see through the guilt. And while Twain was writing, cities were growing upward. The first skyscraper, 1885. Chicago. The home insurance building went up at the corner of LaSalle and Adams Streets, 10 stories high, and became the first building to use a steel frame for structural support. Before that, tall buildings had to have thick masonry walls to hold themselves up, which limited height. But steel frames? You could go as high as you wanted, theoretically. So this 10-story building became the first true skyscraper, even though 10 stories seems quaint now compared to the 100-story towers we have today. It was demolished in 1931 to make room for an even taller building, which is very capitalist and very Chicago. But for a moment, the home insurance building was the future, the first step towards cities that grow up instead of out. And while architecture was reaching new heights, so were American consumer products, Coca-Cola's original recipe. 1886, Atlanta, Georgia. A pharmacist named John Pemberton invented a syrup he called Coca-Cola, sold it as a medicinal tonic. A brain tonic specifically meant to cure headaches, fatigue, and morphine addiction, which is ironic because the original recipe contained cocaine. From coca leaves, obviously, that's the coca in Coca-Cola, plus caffeine from cola nuts, hence cola. It was sold at soda fountains, mixed with carbonated water, 5 cents a glass. And people loved it. Not necessarily for the medicinal benefits, but because it tasted good and gave you energy. Probably because of the cocaine and caffeine. The cocaine was removed in 1903 after public concern about the drug, but the name stayed. And now it's one of the most recognizable brands in the world, born from a pharmacist's attempt to cure headaches with leaves and nuts. Capitalism is weird. But then again, so is everything that came after. 12 seconds of history. December 17th, 1903. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Orville and Wilbur Wright, 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, managed to do what humans had been dreaming about for millennia. They flew. Powered flight, controlled flight, the real deal. Orville went first, lying flat on the lower wing of their Wright Flyer, engine puttering, wooden propellers spinning. He lifted off the sand, traveled 120 feet, and stayed airborne for exactly 12 seconds before landing. 12 seconds. You've had hiccups that lasted longer. Yawns that were more impressive time-wise, but those 12 seconds changed everything. Wilbur took the 4th flight that day and managed 59 seconds, which was practically an eternity by comparison. Within a decade, planes were everywhere. Within 2 decades, they were fighting in wars. And it all started with 12 seconds of wobbling through the air 3 feet off the ground. Sometimes revolutions are shorter than you'd think. But speaking of brief moments with lasting impact, The Day of Three Presidents, March 4th, 1849. Inauguration Day, except it fell on a Sunday, and Zachary Taylor refused to be sworn in on the Sabbath because he was religious like that. So technically, James K. Polk's term ended at noon, but Taylor's hadn't started yet, which meant, constitutionally, the office passed to the president pro tempore of the Senate, David Rice Atchison of Missouri. So, for one day, maybe, America had three presidents. Polk woke up as president, Atchison maybe was president for 24 hours, and Taylor became president on Monday. Except Atchison was never officially sworn in either, so maybe he wasn't president at all. It's a constitutional gray area that historians still debate over whiskey at conferences. Atchison later joked that he slept through most of his presidency, which honestly sounds like the best possible way to handle the job. But while Atchison was napping through his maybe presidency, someone else was making actual presidential history. The bear that started a trend, 1902. Mississippi. Theodore Roosevelt, 26th president, outdoorsman, hunter, generally enthusiastic about killing things in the name of sport, was on a bear hunting trip. Except he wasn't having any luck. So his assistants tracked down a black bear, tied it to a tree, and invited Roosevelt to shoot it for an easy trophy. And Roosevelt, to his credit, refused. Said it was unsportsmanlike, wouldn't be fair. Which is a weird moral line to draw when you're literally there to hunt bears. But okay. A political cartoonist named Clifford Berryman drew a cartoon about it, and a toy store owner in Brooklyn named Morris Mictum saw the cartoon and made a stuffed bear cub, calling it Teddy's Bear. Roosevelt gave permission to use his name, and suddenly everyone wanted one. The teddy bear was born from one moment of presidential restraint. And now they're everywhere, soft and innocent, named after a man who once got shot during a speech and finished the speech anyway. But while Roosevelt was refusing to shoot bears, 5 cents for a show, 1905. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. A guy named Harry Davis opened a small storefront theater and started showing short films for 5 cents admission. Nickel admission, Nickelodeon. The name was right there. It wasn't the first place to show movies, but it was the first dedicated movie theater in America, a space built specifically for film. Before that, movies were shown in vaudeville theaters, fairgrounds, anywhere with a wall and a projector. But Davis's Nickelodeon was different. Just movies, all day. 5 cents. Working class entertainment. No fancy seats, no orchestra pit. Just wooden benches and a screen and the flicker of silent films. Within 3 years, there were thousands of Nickelodeons across America. By the 1920s, we had movie palaces with chandeliers and velvet curtains. The whole thing exploded from a 5-cent storefront in Pittsburgh because people wanted stories, even silent ones, even 12-minute ones. Entertainment is a faster industry than most people realize. And speaking of fast industries, Ford's color philosophy. Henry Ford's Model T launched in 1908. The car that put America on wheels, made automobiles affordable for regular people, revolutionized manufacturing with the assembly line, and Ford famously said customers could have any color they wanted as long as it was black, which sounds like a joke, but wasn't. From 1914 to 1925, every Model T was black. Not because Ford hated color, but because black paint dried faster than other colors, which meant faster production, which meant cheaper cars. Pure efficiency. The assembly line didn't care about your aesthetic preferences. Before 1914, you could actually get a Model T in gray, green, blue, or red. After 1925, colors came back as competition increased. But for over a decade, black was the only option, and 15 million people bought them anyway because having a car in any color beats not having a car at all. Sometimes choice is overrated. But while Ford was painting America black, the late arrival, World War I, started in Europe in 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand assassinated in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, alliances activated like dominoes, and suddenly the whole continent was fighting. Trench warfare, poison gas, millions dead. And America just watched, stayed neutral. President Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," which aged poorly because in April of 1917, the US finally joined. 3 years late, almost the whole war had already happened. Russia was collapsing, France was exhausted, Britain was holding on by willpower and tea. And then America showed up like the friend who arrives at the party right before it ends and acts like that they've been there all night. Granted, American involvement helped end the war in 1918, but still. 3 years is a long time to sit on the sidelines of the deadliest conflict in human history up to that point, but at least when America did join, we commemorated it with mistakes. The upside-down airplane, 1918. The U.S. Postal Service decided to start airmail service, flying letters across the country faster than trains could carry them. Revolutionary idea. Needed a stamp to commemorate it, obviously. So they designed one, 24 cents, blue and red, featuring a Curtiss JN4 biplane. The Jenny, mid-flight. Except somewhere in the printing process at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, someone loaded a sheet upside down, and 100 stamps were printed with the airplane flying inverted. Upside-down Jenny stamps, the most famous stamp error in American history. The Postal Service tried to find and destroy them all, but a few sheets made it out. Collectors went wild. Those stamps are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars now, maybe over $1 million, depending on condition, all because someone had one job, print the plane right side up, and didn't. Which feels appropriate for government work, honestly. But while stamp collectors were getting excited, the government was banning something much more popular, the medicinal exception prohibition. January 17th, 1920. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol across America. The Great Experiment, the Noble Experiment, 13 years of trying to legislate morality and mostly creating organized crime instead. Speakeasies, bootleggers, bathtub gin, all of it. But here's a fun loophole. Medicinal alcohol was still legal. Doctors could prescribe whiskey for ailments, pharmacies could dispense it, and wouldn't you know it, suddenly everyone had a medical condition that required alcohol. Even beer was allowed for medicinal purposes, though good luck convincing your doctor you needed a prescription for Budweiser. The Volstead Act, which enforced prohibition, had exceptions for religious and medicinal use because Congress knew you couldn't completely ban something that had sacramental and pharmaceutical applications. So prohibition didn't actually prohibit everything, just most things, for most people. Compliance was optional anyway. But while America was secretly drinking through the 20s and 30s, professional sports were just getting started. The game with the wrong name. January 15th, 1967. Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. The first championship game between the National Football League and the American Football League, the two rival leagues that would eventually merge. It was officially called the AFL-NFL World Championship Game, which is a mouthful and terrible branding. The name Super Bowl wouldn't become official until the third game in 1969, even though people were already calling it that informally. The name came from Lamar Hunt, owner of the Kansas City Chiefs, who apparently got the idea from watching his kids play with a Super Ball, one of those bouncy rubber toys. So the biggest game in American football is named after a children's toy. The Green Bay Packers won that first game, 35-10, in front of 61,000 fans, which is nothing compared to the 100 million who watch today. Back then, it wasn't even a sellout. Now it's a national holiday in everything but name. And speaking of things that changed over time, the flag that faded July 20th, 1969. Apollo 11 landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the surface, collected rocks, took photos, planted an American flag. That flag is still there, technically, except it's not red, white, and blue anymore. It's white, completely white, because ultraviolet radiation from the sun, unfiltered by any atmosphere, obviously, since the moon doesn't have one, bleached all the color out over the past 50 plus years. So the American flag on the moon is now the universal symbol of surrender, which is darkly hilarious if you think about it. Buzz Aldrin said he saw the flag get knocked over by the exhaust from the lunar module when they took off, so it might be lying down too. A white flag, possibly horizontal, on the moon. There are 5 more flags up there from later Apollo missions, all probably white now too. Symbols don't last forever, even in a vacuum. But while we're talking about presidential symbols and moments, Washington's brevity, George Washington's second inaugural address. March 4th, 1793. Philadelphia. Second term, still figuring out what being president even meant. And Washington apparently decided that less was more. His entire speech was 135 words long. 135. You could read it in under a minute. Basically just said, "I'm taking the oath again. I'll do my best. Thanks for your trust. Goodbye." Shortest inaugural address in American history. No grand vision, no policy proposals, no soaring rhetoric about the American experiment. Just a guy who didn't want to be president, but was anyway, keeping his remarks brief and getting back to work. You have to respect the efficiency. Although you also have to wonder if he just didn't want to write a speech, which is extremely relatable. But if Washington's speech was too short, someone else went the opposite direction. Harrison's fatal verbosity. March 4th, 1841. Washington, D.C. William Henry Harrison, 9th president, oldest president at the time, 68 years old, and determined to prove he was vigorous and healthy despite concerns about his age. So he delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, 8,445 words, 1 hour and 45 minutes in the cold rain, no coat, no hat, just standing there in freezing weather, talking about Roman history and Republican virtue and Cincinnatus and all sorts of classical references nobody asked for. And then he got sick. Pneumonia, probably, though some historians think it was typhoid from contaminated water in the White House. Either way, exactly 1 month later, April 4th, 1841, he died. Shortest presidency in American history. 1 month, some of which he spent unconscious. So Harrison gave the longest speech, served the shortest term, and became a cautionary tale about overcompensating. Wear a coat, keep your speech short, live longer than 30 days. But at least Harrison had 1 complete term, unlike one president who split his into 2. Cleveland's comeback, Grover Cleveland. 22nd and 24th president, the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, which sounds like a technicality but is actually impressive. He won in 1884, lost to Benjamin Harrison in 1888, lost the Electoral College but won the popular vote, a recurring theme in American elections, then came back and won again in 1892. So he's 2 presidents in 1, technically. 2 different administrations, 4 years apart, which means when historians count presidents, they count Cleveland twice, even though he's 1 person. He's why we've had 46 presidencies, but only 45 presidents. Joe Biden is the 46th president, but only the 45th person to hold the office. Cleveland was president, then not president, then president again, which must have been weird for everyone involved. Imagine losing your job, watching someone else do it for 4 years, then getting it back. That's Cleveland. But while Cleveland was making presidential history, the Treasury was making a different kind, Lincoln's penny, 1909, the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth, and the U.S. Mint decided to commemorate it by putting Lincoln's face on the penny. First time a president appeared on regular U.S. circulation coinage. Before that, coins featured abstract figures, Lady Liberty, eagles, shields, allegorical representations of America. But never an actual historical person, never a president. Too monarchical, people thought. Too much like putting kings on coins. But by 1909, Lincoln was sufficiently mythologized, sufficiently martyred, sufficiently dead for 54 years that it felt appropriate. Sculptor Victor David Brenner designed it. Lincoln's profile on the front, wheat stalks on the back. Those wheat pennies stayed in production until 1958, when they switched to the Lincoln Memorial design. And now we have billions of Lincoln pennies floating around, each one worth approximately 1 cent, though they cost more than that to manufacture. The government loses money on pennies. Lincoln would probably find that ironic, but while the government was making coins nobody wanted. The War of One Casualty, the Pig War. 1859. San Juan Islands between Washington Territory and British Columbia. Border dispute between the United States and Britain over exactly where the boundary ran after the Oregon Treaty of 1846. Both sides had settlers on the islands. Tensions were high. And then on June 15th, 1859, an American settler named Lyman Cutler found a pig eating his potatoes. The pig belonged to an Irishman employed by the Hudson's Bay Company, which was British. Cutler shot the pig. Britain demanded compensation. America refused. Both sides sent military forces. Warships, soldiers, the whole thing. For months, British and American troops occupied opposite ends of the island, technically at war, ready to fight. Over a pig. But nobody fired a shot. Nobody died except the pig. Diplomats eventually negotiated a settlement. 12 years later, an arbitrator determined the islands belonged to the U.S. The only casualty of the pig war was one pig. Sometimes restraint is the real victory. And speaking of territory worth protecting, Yellowstone's founding, March 1st, 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act, creating the first national park in the United States and the world. 2 million acres of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho set aside for preservation and public enjoyment. Geysers, hot springs, waterfalls, wildlife, all protected from private development. It was a radical idea, land that belonged to everyone, managed by the government, kept wild forever. Before that, land was something you owned or exploited or settled. But Yellowstone established the precedent that some places were too important, too beautiful, too unique to turn into somebody's ranch or mining operation. The idea spread. Yosemite, Sequoia, Grand Canyon, eventually dozens more. The National Park Service wasn't created until 1916, so for the first 44 years, Yellowstone was managed by the U.S. Army, which must have been a strange assignment for cavalry soldiers used to fighting. Congratulations, you're now protecting geothermal features, but while the government was preserving wilderness, cities were building institutions. America's first zoo, 1874. Philadelphia. The Zoological Society of Philadelphia opened the first true zoo in the United States. 3,000 animals representing over 200 species, all on 42 acres of carefully planned habitats, or at least what people in the 1870s thought were carefully planned habitats, which by modern standards were probably too small and sad. But at the time, it was revolutionary. Before this, Americans had seen exotic animals at traveling menageries or circuses, temporary exhibits with animals in cages. But a permanent zoo meant education, conservation, research. Admission was 25 cents for adults, 10 cents for children. People flocked to see lions, elephants, monkeys, animals they'd only read about or seen in drawings. The Philadelphia Zoo became the model for zoos across the country. Still operates today, oldest zoo in America, still trying to balance entertainment with animal welfare, still figuring out what it means to keep wild animals in cities. History is full of good intentions with complicated outcomes, but while Philadelphia was collecting animals, Boston was digging underground. The subway beneath Boston, September 1st, 1897. Boston became the first U.S. city with a subway system, the Tremont Street subway, running from Park Street to Boylston Street. 1.8 miles of tunnel beneath downtown, carrying electric streetcars underground to ease surface traffic congestion. Before that, Boston streets were chaos. Too many trolleys, too many people, everything jammed together. So they dug, used a cut and cover method, digging trenches in the street, building the tunnel, then covering it back up. Took 2 years and 21 deaths, which sounds horrific until you remember that infrastructure projects in the 1890s had casualty rates that would shut down modern construction sites permanently. But the subway worked. It expanded, became the T system that Bostonians still use today, still complain about, still depend on completely. America's first subway, and like everything in Boston, it's unreliable and fiercely defended by everyone who uses it. But before cities were going underground, buildings were learning to go up. The elevator that changed architecture. March 23rd, 1857, New York City. The Hofwout building on Broadway installed the first passenger elevator in an American building, designed by Elisha Otis, the same guy who invented the safety brake that kept elevators from plummeting to the ground if the cable snapped. Before that safety feature, elevators were for freight only, too dangerous for people. But Otis's brake changed everything. Suddenly, you could put people in a box and lift them 5 stories without risking their lives, probably. The Hofwout building was a commercial building, cast iron facade, selling fancy china and glassware. And now you could shop on the upper floors without climbing stairs, which was revolutionary for retail and architecture. Skyscrapers became possible. Not just structurally, steel frames helped with that, but practically. Nobody wants to walk up 50 flights of stairs. Elevators made vertical cities feasible. And it all started with one steam-powered elevator in a store selling dishes. But while buildings were going up safely, personal disputes were finally being handled less violently. The duels end. February 20th, 1839. Congress passed a law outlawing dueling in the District of Columbia. Took them long enough. Dueling had been a gentleman's way of settling disputes for centuries. Someone insults your honor, you challenge them, you meet at dawn with pistols, someone probably dies. Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel in 1804 in New Jersey, and people finally started thinking maybe this was a bad system for conflict resolution. But it took another 35 years for Congress to officially ban it in D.C. Other states had already outlawed it, but enforcement was spotty. Men still dueled in secret across state lines, wherever they could avoid prosecution. Andrew Jackson participated in multiple duels before becoming president, killed a man named Charles Dickinson in 1806 over a horse racing debt and an insult to his wife. So dueling persisted well into the 19th century, even after it was illegal, because some people really committed to the idea that violence solved arguments. Progress is slower than we'd like, but at least it happens eventually. The census that missed millions, 1790. The first U.S. census, mandated by the Constitution to count the population every 10 years for congressional representation. Marshals on horseback traveling from town to town, knocking on doors. recording names and numbers. They counted 3.9 million people total, except that number was wildly incomplete. The census missed approximately 2 million people, maybe more. Enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, the infamous compromise, but many weren't counted at all. Native Americans weren't counted unless they paid taxes. Women and children were often recorded as tick marks under the household head's name, no individual data. And in frontier areas, whole communities were probably skipped because they were too remote or the marshal didn't feel like riding that far. So America's first official population count was more like a rough estimate with legal implications. We've gotten better at it since then, though census accuracy is still debated every decade. But while the census was counting people, the flag was changing too. 27 versions of stars, the American flag, 50 stars, 13 stripes, red, white, and blue. Except it hasn't always been 50 stars. The flag has been redesigned 27 times since 1777 as new states joined the Union. Started with 13 stars for the original colonies, then 15 stars and 15 stripes in 1795 when Vermont and Kentucky joined. They added stripes too, briefly, before realizing that was unsustainable. Back to 13 stripes in 1818, but stars kept getting added. 20 stars, 24, 33, 38, 48 for most of the 20th century, after Arizona and New Mexico joined in 1912. Then Alaska in 1959 made it 49 stars for exactly 1 year before Hawaii joined in 1960, giving us the current 50-star design. That's the longest any version has lasted since July 4th, 1960. 65 years and counting, which means if you're under 65, you've only ever known one flag. But before flags, there were stamps. The first sticky messages, July 1st, 1847. The U.S. Post Office Department issued the first official postage stamps, 2 designs, a 5-cent stamp featuring Benjamin Franklin, who was the first Postmaster General, and a 10-cent stamp with George Washington, because of course. Before this, you paid postage when the letter was delivered, or sometimes the recipient paid, or you had to arrange payment at the post office. It was inefficient and confusing. But stamps? You bought them, stuck them on your letter, dropped it in a box, and the system handled it. Revolutionary. The Franklin stamp paid for letters traveling under 300 miles. The Washington stamp was for longer distances. They weren't even perforated at first. You had to cut them apart with scissors. Perforations came in 1857, so for 10 years, people were carefully scissoring stamps like crafts projects. Small innovations, huge impact. And speaking of political innovations that seemed small at the time, the party of knowing nothing, the 1850s. America was growing fast, and immigrants were arriving by the thousands. Irish Catholics fleeing the potato famine, Germans seeking political freedom, and some Americans didn't like it. So they formed a political party officially called the American Party, but everyone called them the Know Nothing Party. Why? Because it started as a secret society. When members were asked about their activities, they were supposed to say, "I know nothing." Very mysterious, very paranoid. Their whole platform was anti-immigration and anti-Catholic. They wanted to restrict immigration, require 21 years of residency before citizenship, and keep Catholics out of public office. They actually won some elections, controlled Massachusetts for a while, had dozens of congressmen, ran Millard Fillmore for president in 1856. He got 22% of the vote. But by the late 1850s, the party collapsed because slavery became the dominant issue and everything else seemed less important. Still, they existed. American nativism in political party form. But long before political parties were restricting votes. 1756, Uxbridge, Massachusetts, town meeting, and a woman named Lydia Chapin Taft cast a vote, legally. on record. Probably the first woman to vote in colonial America, definitely the first documented case. Her husband, Josiah Taft, had died, and as a wealthy widow and taxpayer, she was allowed to vote on town matters in his place. 3 times, actually. She voted in 1756, 1758, and 1765 on local issues. Not for representatives, not for major political positions, just town business. But still, a legal vote, recorded in town minutes, while women everywhere else were explicitly barred from voting. Massachusetts apparently had a brief moment of accidental feminism before reverting to the standard exclusion. It would be another 164 years before the 19th Amendment gave all American women the right to vote in 1920. Lydia Taft was just incredibly early. Sometimes rights come in strange, isolated moments before they become universal. And speaking of where universal rights were first debated, the forgotten first capital, Philadelphia, the birthplace of American independence. The Continental Congress met there. The Declaration was signed there. The Constitution was written there. And from 1790 to 1800, it was the nation's capital. Not Washington, D.C., not New York, though New York was briefly the capital from 1789 to 1790. Philadelphia. Congress met at Congress Hall. George Washington lived in the President's house on Market Street. John Adams lived there too for his entire presidency. The Supreme Court was there. All 3 branches of government conducting the business of the young nation in Pennsylvania. But the Residence Act of 1790 designated a new federal district along the Potomac River, future Washington, D.C., which wouldn't be ready until 1800. So Philadelphia was the temporary capital, while the real capital was under construction. 10 years as the center of American government, then back to being just a city. Must have been strange watching power move south. But while Philadelphia was hosting the government, that government was being secretly designed, the convention behind closed doors, summer of 1787. Philadelphia, again. The Constitutional Convention, 55 delegates from 12 states. Rhode Island refused to participate, meeting at Independence Hall to fix the Articles of Confederation. Except they didn't fix them. They threw them out and wrote something completely new. And they did it in secret. Windows nailed shut despite the summer heat, guards at the doors, no press allowed, delegates sworn to secrecy, because they knew if the public heard the arguments, the compromises, the debates about slavery and representation and executive power, the whole thing would fall apart. So they sweated through a Philadelphia summer in sealed rooms, arguing for 4 months, and emerged with the Constitution. James Madison took notes, but those weren't published until 1840, after everyone involved was dead. So for over 50 years, nobody really knew what happened in that room. Democracy built in secrecy, revealed gradually. And once that Constitution was written, states had to decide whether to accept it. Delaware's swift approval, December 7th, 1787. Delaware became the first state to ratify the Constitution. Unanimous vote, 30-0, took them 5 days after the Constitution was presented to their convention. They wanted in. First state, first in line, so enthusiastic about federal union that they put it on their license plates centuries later. The first state. Delaware was small, worried about being dominated by larger neighbors like Pennsylvania and Maryland, and saw the Constitution's structure, with a Senate giving equal representation to all states, as protection. So they ratified immediately, didn't even debate that long. Other states took months, held contentious conventions, demanded a Bill of Rights. Massachusetts barely ratified. Rhode Island held out until 1790, the last state to join. But Delaware, 5 days. Done. Delaware's state pride about being first is unmatched, and Honestly, they earned it. Fast decisions are rare in American democracy, but not all political decisions are fast, and not all political parties survive their internal contradictions. The Whigs who disappeared, the Whig Party, formed in the 1830s in opposition to Andrew Jackson's Democrats. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, 4 Whig presidents total. The party stood for modernization, economic development, national banks, infrastructure, but by the 1850s, slavery was tearing everything apart. Northern Whigs opposed slavery's expansion. Southern Whigs wanted to protect it. The Compromise of 1850 tried to hold things together, didn't work. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 destroyed whatever unity remained. Northern Whigs left to join the new Republican Party. Southern Whigs either joined Democrats or disappeared into irrelevance. By 1856, the Whig Party was dead, just dissolved. Couldn't survive being on both sides of the defining issue of the era. Political parties die when their internal contradictions become unsustainable. The Whigs are American history's clearest example. But while political parties were collapsing over ideology, ships were exploding for murkier reasons. Remember the Maine, February 15th, 1898. Havana Harbor, Cuba. The USS Maine, an American battleship sent to protect U.S. interests during Cuban unrest against Spanish rule, exploded at 9:40 p.m. 266 sailors died. The forward third of the ship just detonated, sank in minutes. Nobody knew why. Probably a coal bunker fire reached the ammunition magazines, most modern analyses suggest. But at the time, newspapers, especially William Randolph Hearst's papers, blamed Spain. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became the rallying cry. America declared war on Spain 2 months later. The Spanish-American War, which we covered earlier, 3 months long, America became an imperial power. All because of an explosion that probably wasn't Spain's fault. But facts didn't matter, public sentiment did. Yellow journalism did. And 266 sailors died. And their deaths were used to justify a war they never asked for. History turns on moments like that. But while wars were starting over accidents, settlers were creating governments without permission. The territory that wasn't 1859. Colorado, except it wasn't Colorado yet. Still unorganized territory. Gold was discovered in the Pikes Peak area, the Colorado Gold Rush, and suddenly thousands of miners flooded in, setting up camps, towns, makeshift communities. But there was no government, no law, no official territorial status. So the miners just created their own. The territory of Jefferson, named after Thomas Jefferson, obviously, even though he'd been dead 33 years. They elected officials, drafted a constitution, established laws, collected taxes, all completely unofficial. Congress hadn't approved it. The federal government didn't recognize it. It was a self-governing territory that existed in legal limbo from October 1859 until February 1861, when Congress finally created the official Colorado Territory. So, for over a year, Jefferson Territory operated as a provisional government, doing government things without being an actual government. Very American entrepreneurial spirit. If the government won't show up, just make your own. But while some Americans were creating unofficial governments, others were creating new ways to spend money they didn't have. The card that changed spending, 1950. New York City. Frank McNamara, a businessman, went to dinner and realized he'd forgotten his wallet. Embarrassing. Had to call his wife to bring money. And he thought, what if there was a card you could use instead of cash? So he created the Diners Club card. Not quite a credit card in the modern sense. You had to pay the full balance every month. more like a charge card, but it worked at participating restaurants. You signed for your meal, the restaurant sent the bill to Diners Club. Diners Club charged you. First year, 200 card holders, 14 restaurants. Within a decade, millions of cards accepted worldwide. Bank of America launched the Bank AmeriCard in 1958, later became Visa, and suddenly credit was everywhere. The ability to buy things with money you didn't have yet, normalized and plastic. America's economy runs on credit now, all because one guy forgot his wallet at dinner and decided forgetting wallets was inefficient. But long before credit cards, another American innovation was being banned for being too fun. Massachusetts bans Christmas, 1659. The Puritans who ran Massachusetts decided Christmas was too pagan, too Catholic, too much feasting and merriment and not enough solemn religious observation. So they banned it. Illegal to celebrate Christmas. Anyone caught observing the holiday, decorating, feasting, taking the day off work, would be fined 5 shillings, which was not insignificant money. The ban lasted 22 years, from 1659 to 1681, when the British Crown revoked it because even England thought Massachusetts Puritans were taking things too far. But even after the ban was lifted, celebrating Christmas remained socially frowned upon in parts of New England for decades. Some schools held classes on December 25th, well into the 1800s. So, America's Christmas tradition isn't as traditional as it seems. For a long time, lots of Americans thought Christmas was suspect, not sacred, just suspicious. Things change, culture shifts. Now we start celebrating in November. But speaking of celebrations and food traditions, Madison's frozen innovation, March 4th, 1813. James Madison's second inaugural ball. Washington, D.C., cold day, but the celebration was indoors, warm, crowded with Washington's elite, and Dolly Madison, First Lady, social architect, the woman who popularized the name White House, decided to serve ice cream. Not a new invention, ice cream had existed for centuries, but serving it at a presidential inaugural ball was bold, exotic, impressive. Keeping ice cream frozen in March without refrigeration required ice harvested from frozen rivers in winter and stored in ice houses, packed in sawdust. Expensive, labor-intensive, a status symbol. And Dolly served it anyway because presentation mattered. The guests loved it. Ice cream became a fashionable dessert at high society events. Dolly Madison's ice cream wasn't the first in America, but her endorsement made it desirable. Sometimes history is shaped by what important people choose to eat. And speaking of people who almost ate at the presidential table, Atchison's maybe presidency redux. We talked about David Rice Atchison earlier, the senator who might have been president for one day when Zachary Taylor refused to be inaugurated on a Sunday in 1849. But let's revisit it because it's genuinely weird. Legally, if the president-elect doesn't take office when the previous president's term ends, the position passes to the president pro tempore of the Senate, which was Atchison. So technically, maybe he was president from noon March 4th to noon March 5th, except he was never sworn in, never took the oath, slept through most of the day. And later historians argue that without the oath, there's no presidency, so the office was simply vacant for 24 hours, which is also weird. So either America had no president for a day, or David Rice Atchison was president while sleeping, or Zachary Taylor was technically president-elect in limbo. Constitutional ambiguity at its finest. Congress fixed the issue in 1933 with the 20th Amendment, moving inauguration to January and clarifying succession. But for one weird day in 1849, nobody really knew who was in charge. And speaking of recognition that came late, the coin with a woman's face, 1979. The U.S. Mint released the Susan B. Anthony dollar coin. First time a real, non-allegorical woman appeared on circulating U.S. currency. Susan B. Anthony, suffragist, abolitionist, women's rights advocate who died in 1906, finally honored on a coin 73 years after her death. The coin itself was unpopular, too similar in size to a quarter, easy to confuse, vending machines hated it, and production stopped after 3 years, briefly restarted in 1999. Most people never used them, but symbolically, it mattered. A woman on U.S. currency. Took 203 years of American coinage history to get there. The Sacagawea dollar replaced it in 2000. Then the Harriet Tubman $20 bill was proposed but delayed indefinitely. Progress on representation is real but slow. But while modern America was slowly recognizing women's contributions, 19th century political parties were already fighting over freedom. The Party Against Expansion, the Free Soil Party, existed from 1848 to 1854. Single Issue Party opposed the expansion of slavery into new U.S. territories, not abolish slavery where it existed. That was too radical for most. Just stop it from spreading. Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men was their slogan. They pulled anti-slavery Democrats and Whigs together, ran Martin Van Buren for president in 1848. He got 10% of the vote. Not enough to win, but enough to split the Democratic vote and help Whig candidate Zachary Taylor win. By 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act made the free soil position mainstream, and most members joined the new Republican Party, which absorbed their platform. So, the Free Soil Party died by succeeding. Their issue became the Republican Party's core identity. Sometimes third parties exist to push major parties toward change, then dissolve once that change happens. American political evolution in 6 years. But while political parties were fighting over serious issues, Americans were also inventing new ways to scream. The first ride down June 16, 1884, Coney Island, Brooklyn, New York. The Switchback Railway opened, often credited as America's first true roller coaster, designed specifically for amusement. Built by Lamarcus Adna Thompson, the ride sent passengers coasting down a 600-foot track at 6 miles per hour. 6 miles per hour. You walk faster. But in 1884, when most people traveled by foot or horse, 6 miles per hour on a track while sitting in a car going downhill felt thrilling. Cost a nickel to ride. The coaster made $300 a day initially. That's 6,000 riders daily, which is absurd. People loved it. Within a few years, Coney Island had multiple coasters, faster and taller. The roller coaster became an American entertainment staple, engineered specifically to provide safe danger. Controlled fear. You scream, but you're fine. Peak amusement park philosophy. And speaking of American institutions built on fine distinctions, the half-breeds versus stalwarts. The Republican Party in the 1870s and 80s wasn't united. Two factions fought for control, the stalwarts and the half-breeds. The stalwarts, led by Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, supported the spoils system, appointing political supporters to government jobs regardless of qualifications. The half-breeds, led by James G. Blaine of Maine, wanted civil service reform, government jobs based on merit, not patronage. Both factions were still pro-business, pro-tariff, waving the bloody shirt of Civil War memory. But the patronage fight was vicious. James Garfield, a half-breed, won the presidency in 1880. Charles Guiteau, a mentally ill stalwart supporter who had been refused a government job, assassinated Garfield in 1881, claiming, "I am a stalwart and Arthur is president now." Chester Arthur, the new president and former stalwart, then shocked everyone by supporting civil service reform, passing the Pendleton Act in 1883. Assassination changed policy. Factions dissolved. Government hiring improved slightly. History turns on strange pivot points. And speaking of American innovations in leisure, the theater you drive to June 6, 1933, Camden, New Jersey. Richard Hollingshead opened the first drive-in movie theater. Park-in theaters, he called it. The idea was simple: outdoor screen, parked cars, speakers on poles, later changed to in-car speakers in the 1940s. Families could watch movies without leaving their cars, which was perfect for the automobile-obsessed 30s. Kids could come in pajamas. You could talk during the movie without bothering anyone. Privacy, convenience, accessibility. Admission was 25 cents per car, plus 25 cents per person, up to $1 maximum. The first movie shown was Wife Beware, a British comedy nobody remembers, but the concept exploded. By the 50s, 4,000 drive-ins operated across America. They declined with suburban multiplexes and VCRs, but never fully disappeared. Some still exist, nostalgia and novelty combined. The drive-in theater is peak American innovation. Take two existing things, cars and movies, and combine them in a way that feels both lazy and ingenious. And that combination of lazy and ingenious continues throughout American history. The Mugwumps who switched sides, 1884. Presidential election. Republican Party nominated James G. Blaine, who was charismatic and corrupt in roughly equal measure, and a group of reform-minded Republicans looked at Blaine and said, "Absolutely not." So they bolted. Left the party. Supported Democrat Grover Cleveland instead because Cleveland was honest, if boring. These defectors were called mugwumps, supposedly from an Algonquian word meaning important person or chief, but their opponents claimed it meant they had their mug on one side of the fence and their wump on the other. Fence-sitters, traitors. But the mugwumps saw themselves as principled reformers, choosing integrity over party loyalty. They were mostly educated, wealthy, Northeastern Republicans who cared more about civil service reform than partisan victory. Cleveland won by a tiny margin. The mugwumps probably made the difference. And their name entered the political lexicon as shorthand for people who switch sides over principle. Whether that's admirable or treasonous depends on your perspective. But while political reformers were switching parties, technological innovators were making shopping easier. The machine that sells, 1888. The first vending machines appeared in America, installed on elevated train platforms in New York City. They dispensed Tutti Frutti gum manufactured by the Thomas Adams Gum Company. 1 penny, 1 piece of gum, no human interaction required. Revolutionary for retail. Before vending machines, you needed a person to sell you things. Shopkeepers, street vendors, someone with hands and a till. But a machine? Just engineering and trust. Drop your coin, receive your product, move along. The concept caught on immediately. By the early 1900s, vending machines sold postcards, stamps, cigarettes, even full meals in automats. Japan would later perfect the vending machine culture, but America started it with gum on train platforms. 1 penny at a time, commerce became automated. Convenience became king. And we've been feeding coins into machines ever since, hoping they'll actually give us what we paid for. But while machines were handling small transactions, politicians were arguing about what money even meant, the silver standard dreamers, the 1890s. America was on the gold standard, currency backed by gold reserves, which kept money stable but tight. Farmers and debtors hated it. They wanted inflation, easier credit, more money in circulation. So they pushed for bimetallism, currency backed by both gold and silver. The Silver Republicans emerged as a faction supporting this policy, splitting from the Maine Republican Party during the 1896 election. They endorsed Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who delivered his famous Cross of Gold speech demanding silver coinage. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," he declared. Very dramatic, very populist. But Bryan lost. Gold standard stayed. The Silver Republicans faded, eventually rejoining the main party or drifting into irrelevance. The whole debate seems technical and boring now, but it was the defining economic issue of the era. Currency policy as culture war. Some things never change, just the specific policy. And speaking of changes that seemed mundane but transformed daily life, the light that controls traffic. August 5th, 1914. Cleveland, Ohio. The first electric traffic light in America was installed at the corner of East 105th Street and Euclid Avenue. Red and green lights, manually operated by a police officer in a nearby booth. Not automatic, not yet. Just a signal system that told drivers and pedestrians when to stop and go without requiring a cop to stand in the intersection waving his arms. Before this, traffic was chaos. Busy intersections were accidents waiting to happen, or accidents actively happening. The traffic light brought order. Detroit installed the first four-way, three-color traffic signal in 1920, adding yellow as a warning. Then automation came, timers and sensors, and now we have millions of traffic lights controlling the flow of civilization, preventing daily carnage. You sit at a red light at 2 a.m., with no other cars in sight, and you wait because the light says so. That's the social contract. That's Cleveland's gift to modernity. But while Cleveland was organizing traffic, Theodore Roosevelt was creating political chaos. The Bull Moose Rebellion, 1912. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to be president again. He'd already served from 1901 to 1909, chosen not to run in 1908, endorsed William Howard Taft as his successor, then spent the next 4 years becoming increasingly furious with Taft's conservatism. So Roosevelt challenged Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912. Lost. The party establishment chose Taft, and Roosevelt said, "Fine, I'll make my own party." The Progressive Party, officially. The Bull Moose Party, colloquially. Because Roosevelt told reporters he felt strong as a bull moose. Third-party campaigns usually fail, but Roosevelt came in second, beating Taft, winning 88 electoral votes. Democrat Woodrow Wilson won the presidency. The split Republican vote handed Democrats the White House. The Bull Moose Party dissolved after 1916. But for one election cycle, a former president ran as a third-party candidate and nearly pulled it off. Peak Roosevelt, aggressive, optimistic, doomed. And while Roosevelt was charging into political battles, technology was bringing voices into homes. The first commercial broadcast, November 2nd, 1920. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. KDKA began broadcasting, often credited as America's first commercial radio station, though some stations claim earlier broadcasts. KDKA's first program reported the results of the 1920 presidential election, Warren G. Harding defeating James Cox. People gathered around radio receivers, hearing news in real time, not reading about it the next morning. Revolutionary. Before radio information traveled at the speed of print, newspapers, telegrams, letters, but radio was instant, intimate, invisible. Voices in your living room transmitted through the air like magic that was actually science. Within a decade, radio was everywhere. Families planned their evenings around broadcasts. Presidents spoke directly to citizens via fireside chats. Entertainment, news, advertising, all through one box with knobs and static. KDKA is still broadcasting today, over a century later, one of the oldest radio stations in the world. From election results in 1920 to whatever's on now, but while radio was a new innovation, some political movements were throwbacks to earlier American ideals. The Democrats who hated banks, the 1830s. The Democratic Party wasn't monolithic. One radical faction called themselves the Loco-Focos, named after a brand of self-lighting matches they used to light candles during a chaotic party meeting in 1835, when Tammany Hall operatives tried to shut them down by turning off the gas lamps. Very dramatic, very on-brand. The Loco-Focos opposed banks, paper money, monopolies, and corporate charters. They wanted hard currency, gold and silver, and equal rights for working people. Anti-establishment Democrats in an era when establishment meant wealthy merchants and bankers with political connections. They were absorbed back into the Maine Democratic Party by the 1840s, but their influence persisted. Jacksonian democracy, with its distrust of central banking and corporate power, carried Loco-Foco DNA. Sometimes the radicals don't win, but shape the mainstream anyway. Their ideas outlast their organization. And just as radio brought voices into homes decades later, television was about to bring pictures, the first flickers of television. 1928, Schenectady, New York. General Electric's experimental television station, XP, later WRGB, began broadcasting. One of the first television stations in America, transmitting grainy, flickering images to the handful of people who owned experimental TV sets. The picture quality was terrible, maybe 40 lines of resolution. Faces looked like blurry suggestions of faces. But it was television. Moving pictures transmitted wirelessly through the air into homes. Science fiction made real. The technology improved slowly. NBC and CBS started TV broadcasts in the late 1930s. World War II paused civilian development. But by the late 1940s, television exploded. By the 1950s, it dominated American culture. And WRGB kept broadcasting, evolving from experimental novelty to mainstream station. Still operates today, one of the oldest TV stations in the country. From barely visible images in 1928 to high-definition streaming today. Progress is incremental, then suddenly everywhere. But before television was debating picture quality, Americans were debating currency itself, the party of paper money, the Greenback Party. Formed in 1874, post-Civil War, when the economy was contracting and farmers were drowning in debt. During the war, the U.S. issued paper currency, greenbacks, not backed by gold or silver, just government promise. After the war, the government started withdrawing greenbacks, returning to hard currency, which tightened the money supply and made debts harder to pay. The Greenback Party wanted to keep paper money in circulation, expand it even, to create inflation and help debtors. They ran presidential candidates in 1876, 1880, and 1884. Never won, but influenced policy. Their ideas merged with later movements like the Populists and Silver Republicans. The debate over currency, hard money versus paper, gold versus silver versus fiat, dominated late 19th century politics. Boring to modern ears, life or death to farmers and workers at the time. Your position on currency was your identity. And while 19th century Americans were arguing about money, 20th century Americans were building machines that would eventually handle money for them. The computer that filled a room, 1945. University of Pennsylvania. ENIAC, Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, was completed. The first general-purpose electronic digital computer built in the United States. It weighed 30 tons, occupied 1,800 square feet, used 18,000 vacuum tubes, and consumed enough electricity to dim lights across Philadelphia when turned on. It could perform 5,000 additions per second, which sounds slow now, but was staggeringly fast then. The Army used it to calculate artillery firing tables. Took two women, programmers Betty Jean Jennings and Frances Bylas, 6 weeks to program the first calculation manually setting switches and cables. No keyboard, no monitor, just hardware configuration. ENIAC ran until 1955. By then, computers were getting smaller, faster, more practical. The whole history of computing is miniaturization, from room size to desktop to laptop to pocket. ENIAC was the room-sized beginning, the vacuum tube grandfather of your smartphone. And while ENIAC was calculating firing tables, political movements were calculating their own trajectories. The Populists' brief rise, 1892. The People's Party, better known as the populists, emerged from agrarian discontent in the South and West. Farmers felt exploited by railroads, banks, commodity traders, and the gold standard. So they organized. The populist platform demanded railroad regulation, direct election of senators, graduated income tax, unlimited silver coinage, and an 8-hour workday. Radical for the time. Their presidential candidate, James B. Weaver, won 8.5% of the popular vote and 22 electoral votes, nearly 10%. That's significant for a third party. But by 1896, Democrats absorbed much of the populist platform and nominated William Jennings Bryan, who appealed to the same voters. Most populists endorsed Bryan. The party dissolved shortly after. They didn't win, but they shifted the conversation. Many populist ideas, direct election of senators, graduated income tax, eventually became constitutional amendments. Third parties often serve as idea laboratories for major parties. The populists proved it, and while populists were organizing farmers, the government was organizing its presence beyond Earth. America's first satellite, January 31st, 1958. Cape Canaveral, Florida, Explorer. One launched aboard a Juno wine rocket, becoming the first U.S. satellite to reach orbit. The Soviets had beaten America into space with Sputnik 1 the previous October, triggering a national panic. America was losing the space race, falling behind technologically, maybe losing the Cold War itself. Explorer 1 was the response, proof that American science could compete. The satellite was small, 30.8 pounds, 6.4 feet long, including the upper stage, but it worked. Carried a cosmic ray detector designed by James Van Allen and discovered the radiation belts surrounding Earth, now called the Van Allen belts, science and propaganda in one package. Explorer 1 stayed in orbit until March 31st, 1970, nearly 12 years. Eventually burned up on re-entry, but by then, America had sent dozens more satellites, astronauts, moon missions. Explorer 1 was just the beginning of America's space ambitions. But while some Americans were reaching for the stars, others were fighting earthbound battles over alcohol. The party that never stopped, the Prohibition Party. Founded in 1869, still exists today, oldest third party in America. Their platform, ban alcohol. That's it. Well, not entirely. They also supported women's suffrage, labor reform, and other progressive causes, but primarily no alcohol. They ran presidential candidates every election from 1872 onward. Never won. Their best showing was 2.2% in 1888. But they influenced the movement. The temperance movement grew throughout the late 1800s, culminating in the 18th Amendment in 1920. Prohibition was enacted. The Prohibition Party's dream realized. Except Prohibition was a disaster. Organized crime, speakeasies, bathtub gin, widespread law-breaking, and was repealed in 1933. The Prohibition Party kept running candidates anyway. Still does. Got 5,000 votes in 2020. Persistence or stubbornness, depending on your view. Some parties never learn. Some parties never stop. And while the Prohibition Party was focused on banning things, the Navy was building something unprecedented. The submarine that changed naval warfare, January 21st, 1954. Groton, Connecticut. The USS Nautilus launched, the world's first operational nuclear-powered submarine. Powered by a nuclear reactor instead of diesel engines, meaning it could stay submerged almost indefinitely, limited only by crew supplies and sanity. Conventional submarines had to surface regularly to recharge batteries. Nuclear subs didn't. True underwater vessels, not just surface ships that could temporarily submerge. The Nautilus proved the concept immediately. On August 3, 1958, it became the first submarine to transit the North Pole underwater, traveling beneath the Arctic ice cap. Strategic implications were enormous. Nuclear submarines could hide anywhere, strike from anywhere, remain undetected for months. The Soviet Union built their own. The submarine arms race began. Nautilus was decommissioned in 1980, now a museum ship in Groton. But nuclear submarines remain the backbone of naval deterrence, silent, invisible, unstoppable, peak Cold War technology. And while the Navy was going nuclear, some political parties were going socialist. The socialists who organized labor. The 1890s. The Socialist Labor Party emerged as one of America's first socialist political organizations, advocating for worker ownership of production, unionization, and an end to capitalism. Founded earlier but gained prominence in the 1890s under Daniel de Leon, a charismatic but rigid leader who alienated almost everyone. The party never succeeded electorally. Too radical, too dogmatic, too invested in ideological purity over coalition building. Membership peaked in the early 1900s but remained small. They ran presidential candidates who received negligible votes. More successful was the Socialist Party of America, founded in 1901 by Eugene Debs and others, which actually won local elections and congressional seats. But the Socialist Labor Party persisted, kept organizing, kept running candidates, kept arguing that capitalism was inherently exploitative. They were right about labor abuses, right about wealth inequality, but too inflexible to build a mass movement. American socialism's perpetual problem, correct diagnosis, unmarketable prescription. But while some Americans were critiquing capitalism, others were building the technology that would define modern warfare. America's first jet fighter, January 8, 1945, Muroc Army Airfield, California, later Edwards Air Force Base. The P-80 Shooting Star took its first flight, becoming America's first operational jet fighter. Jets were the future of aviation, faster, higher, more powerful than propeller-driven aircraft. The British and Germans had jet programs during World War II. America was catching up. The P-80 could fly 594 miles per hour, far faster than the P-51 Mustang's 440. It arrived too late for significant World War II combat. Only two saw service in Italy in the war's final weeks, but proved itself in Korea, where it flew thousands of sorties. The Shooting Star demonstrated that jet technology was viable, practical, scalable. Within a decade, jets dominated military and commercial aviation. Propeller planes became obsolete. The P-80 started that transition. Speed became survival, and that arms race has never stopped. But while national politics were embracing new technologies, state politics were experimenting with party structures. Minnesota's merged movement, Minnesota's Farmer Labor Party, formed in 1918 by merging agrarian and labor movements into one political organization. Farmers and factory workers, traditionally separate constituencies, united over shared economic grievances, low crop prices, low wages, corporate exploitation. The Farmer Labor Party dominated Minnesota politics for decades, elected governors, senators, congressmen, passed progressive legislation, labor protections, social welfare programs, public works. At its peak in the 1930s, it was the most successful state third party in America. But national politics pulled differently. By the 1940s, Democrats and farmer laborites realized they were splitting the liberal vote, letting Republicans win. So in 1944, they merged, creating the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, the DFL, still called that today. Minnesota Democrats have a three-word party name because history is cumulative and compromise is permanent. The Farmer Labor Party succeeded by merging once, then succeeded again by merging twice. Sometimes victory means absorption. And just as Minnesota was merging ground movements, aviation was developing its own revolution upward. The helicopter that worked, September 14, 1939. Stratford, Connecticut. Igor Sikorsky, a Russian immigrant and aviation pioneer, successfully flew the VS-300 helicopter. Not the first helicopter, various experimental models existed, but the first practical one. Controlled, stable, capable of sustained flight. Sikorsky's design used a single main rotor and a smaller tail rotor for stability, the configuration most helicopters still use today. The VS-300 was basically a frame with a seat, an engine, rotors, and Sikorsky's hope that physics would cooperate. It did. He flew it for several minutes. Over the next few years, he refined the design. By World War II, helicopters were being used for reconnaissance, rescue, and transport. By the Korean War, they were evacuating wounded soldiers from battlefields, saving thousands of lives. By Vietnam, they were everywhere. Gunships, troop carriers, medical evacuation. Helicopters changed warfare, disaster response, traffic reporting. Sikorsky's 1939 test flight made all of it possible. One man, one machine, one successful hover, and while Sikorsky was innovating flight, American politics was fracturing over civil rights. The Democrats who walked out, 1948. Democratic National Convention, Philadelphia. President Harry Truman pushed a civil rights plank into the party platform. Anti-lynching legislation, desegregation of the armed forces, protection of voting rights. Northern liberals supported it. Southern Democrats were furious. Strom Thurmond, then governor of South Carolina, led a walkout. Southern delegates left the convention, formed the state's Rights Democratic Party, immediately nicknamed the Dixiecrats, and nominated Thurmond for president. Their platform: preserve segregation, oppose federal civil rights legislation, maintain white supremacy under the language of states' rights. Thurmond carried 4 Deep South states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and 39 electoral votes. Truman still won the presidency, but the Dixiecrat revolt exposed the Democratic Party's fracture. Southern Democrats would slowly drift Republican over the next few decades. The 1964 Civil Rights Act accelerated the realignment. The Dixiecrats didn't win the presidency, but they marked the beginning of the South's political transformation. Sometimes losing reshapes the map. And speaking of institutions that reshaped American life, the People's Bank, April 6, 1909. St. Mary's Bank opened in Manchester, New Hampshire, becoming the first credit union in the United States. Credit unions were cooperative financial institutions. Members pooled their money, made loans to each other at reasonable rates, shared profits, not-for-profit banking. The concept came from Europe, where credit unions helped working-class people access credit without predatory lenders. Pierre Jay, the Massachusetts Bank Commissioner, and Alphonse Desjardins, a Quebec journalist and credit union organizer, helped establish St. Mary's as a model. It served Franco-American textile workers in Manchester, offering loans for emergencies, education, homes. Within a decade, credit unions spread across America. By the 1930s, they were formalized under federal law. Now there are over 5,000 credit unions nationwide, member-owned, democratically controlled, focused on service over profit. St. Mary's still operates today, the oldest credit union in the country, proving that cooperative finance works. Sometimes the alternative to capitalism is just better organized capitalism. And with that thought, we're halfway through our strange journey. The Bull Moose's actual numbers. We talked about Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party earlier, but let's get specific about just how well he did. 1912 presidential election. Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate after losing the Republican nomination to William Howard Taft. And he didn't just participate, he demolished Taft. Roosevelt won 27% of the popular vote. Taft got 23%. A former president running third party beat the sitting president of his own former party. That's unprecedented. Woodrow Wilson won with 42% because the Republican vote split down the middle, but Roosevelt's 27% remains the best showing by any third-party presidential candidate in American history. Better than Ross Perot in 1992, better than George Wallace in 1968, better than anyone else who tried to break the two-party system. Roosevelt proved it was possible to run outside the major parties and still win states' electoral votes and nearly a third of the country. Then he went back to writing books and going on safari because that's what Theodore Roosevelt did when he wasn't being president. But while Roosevelt was challenging political conventions, entrepreneurs were reimagining how Americans traveled. The Motor Hotel Innovation, December 12, 1925. San Luis Obispo, California. The Motel Inn opened along Highway 101, later became U.S. Route 101, becoming America's first motel. Not hotel. Motel, motor hotel. The concept was simple. Rooms you could drive right up to, park your car outside your door, unload your luggage without walking through a lobby, pay less than a traditional hotel. Designed specifically for the automobile age. The architect, Arthur Heinemann, supposedly coined the term motel by combining motor and hotel. Before this, travelers stayed at downtown hotels or roadside cabins. But the motel was different. Convenient, informal, affordable. By the 1950s, motels lined every major highway in America. Franchises like Holiday Inn standardized the experience. The motel became synonymous with American road trips, family vacations, and also seedy affairs and crime scenes, if we're being honest. But it started in San Luis Obispo with one building and a good idea about where people wanted to sleep. And while entrepreneurs were innovating travel accommodations, politicians were creating parties to avoid controversy. The party that ignored the issue, 1860. The country was splitting over slavery. Democrats were fractured, Republicans were growing, and a group of former Whigs, border state moderates, and people who desperately wanted to avoid talking about slavery formed the Constitutional Union Party. Their platform was beautifully vague. Preserve the Constitution, protect the Union, enforce the laws. That's it. No position on slavery's expansion. No position on states' rights versus federal authority. Just let's all get along and pretend the giant national crisis isn't happening. They nominated John Bell of Tennessee for president. He won 3 border states, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and about 13% of the vote. Abraham Lincoln won with 40%. The Constitutional Union Party dissolved immediately after the election because ignoring the defining issue of your era is not a sustainable political strategy. They tried to preserve the Union by avoiding the topic that was tearing it apart. It didn't work. Within months, the Civil War started. Avoidance has never solved anything. But while some institutions tried to avoid conflict, others were built specifically to encourage consumerism. The Mall That Changed Shopping, October 8, 1956. Edina, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis. Southdale Center opened as America's first fully enclosed, climate-controlled shopping mall. Designed by architect Victor Gruen, an Austrian immigrant who envisioned suburban gathering spaces where people could shop, socialize, and escape the weather. 2 levels, 72 stores, a central courtyard with plants and a fountain. Everything indoors. No rain, no snow, no Minnesota winter to endure. Just temperature-controlled consumerism. The concept revolutionized retail. Before Southdale, shopping meant downtown department stores or strip malls exposed to elements, but enclosed malls offered comfort, variety, and the illusion of a town square without the inconveniences of actual public space. By the 1980s, nearly every American suburb had a mall. Teenagers hung out there. Families shopped there. It became the center of suburban life. Now many are dying, killed by online shopping and changing retail patterns, but Southdale still operates, the original enclosed mall, watching its descendants close. And speaking of political innovation during times of crisis, Lincoln's Unity Ticket, 1864. Civil War still raging, outcome uncertain. Abraham Lincoln was running for re-election, and the Republican Party wanted to broaden its appeal. So they temporarily renamed themselves the National Union Party. Not to replace the Republican Party, just to rebrand for one election cycle. The idea was to attract war Democrats, Democrats who supported the Union and the war effort, even if they disagreed with Republicans on other issues. Lincoln's running mate was Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee, the only Southern senator who remained loyal to the Union. Together, they represented national unity, bipartisan commitment to winning the war. Lincoln won decisively. The National Union Party served its purpose. By 1868, Republicans dropped the temporary name and went back to being Republicans. Andrew Johnson, meanwhile, became the first president impeached after Lincoln's assassination. Unity tickets are great in theory, but messy in practice. Sometimes political marriages of convenience end in divorce proceedings. But while Lincoln was managing political coalitions, future innovations were waiting to simplify daily transactions. The barcode's first scan, June 26, 1974. Troy, Ohio. A Marsh supermarket cashier named Sharon Buchanan scanned the first product ever rung up using a universal product code barcode scanner. The product? A pack of Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Gum. 10 sticks, 67 cents. That pack of gum is now in the Smithsonian, immortalized as the beginning of automated retail. Barcodes had been invented earlier, patents filed in the 1950s, standards developed in the early 70s, but this was the first real-world use in a grocery store. Before barcodes, cashiers manually typed prices into registers. Time-consuming, error-prone, inefficient. Barcodes changed everything. Faster checkout, better inventory tracking, instant price updates. Within a decade, they were everywhere. Now you can't buy anything without scanning or being scanned. That pack of gum started the automation that eventually led to self-checkout, where you scan your own items and the machine judges you for buying 3 frozen pizzas at once. But while gum was being scanned in Ohio, political reformers were trying to scan the Republican Party, the liberal breakaway, 1872. President Ulysses S. Grant was running for re-election. But some Republicans were disgusted with his administration's corruption, scandals involving whiskey taxes, Indian trading posts, railroad subsidies. So they bolted, formed the Liberal Republican Party, called themselves liberal because they supported civil service reform, low tariffs, and reconciliation with the South. Liberal in the classical 19th century sense, not the modern sense. They nominated Horace Greeley, the famous newspaper editor, for president. The Democrats, desperate to beat Grant, also nominated Greeley. So Greeley ran as both the liberal Republican and Democratic candidate, which was awkward because he had spent decades attacking Democrats in his newspaper. Grant won easily. Greeley died 3 weeks after the election, heartbroken and exhausted. The Liberal Republican Party dissolved. Most members returned to the regular Republican Party. The whole episode lasted one election cycle. Sometimes political rebellions fail immediately and completely, but at least they tried reforming from within. And speaking of innovations that try to make life more convenient, the machine that gives cash, September 2nd, 1969. Rockville, Centerbears, New York. Chemical Bank installed the first ATM, automated teller machine, in the United States. Actually called a docu-teller at the time because ATM wasn't standard terminology yet. Customers could withdraw cash using a special card and a PIN code. Maximum withdrawal, $10. $10 because the bank didn't trust the machines or the customers enough to allow more. The machine didn't even give receipts initially. You just had to trust that it worked correctly, which seems optimistic for late 60s technology. But it did work. Within a decade, ATMs were everywhere. By the 1980s, you could withdraw cash 24 hours a day, which felt like the future. Now there are over 400,000 ATMs in the US, and we complain when one charges a $3 fee. The DocuTeller started all of it. Automated banking, 24-hour access, convenience fees. Chemical Bank merged with Chase decades ago. But their ATM legacy lives forever. And while banks were automating in the 20th century, politicians in the 19th were radicalizing. The Republicans who radicalized Reconstruction, the Radical Republicans, a faction within the Republican Party during and after the Civil War who pushed for aggressive policies on slavery's abolition and the South's Reconstruction. Leaders included Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate. They wanted immediate emancipation, full civil rights for formerly enslaved people, harsh punishment for Confederate leaders, and federal intervention to protect black voting rights in the South. More aggressive than Lincoln, who favored gradual reconciliation. After Lincoln's assassination, they clashed with Andrew Johnson constantly, eventually impeaching him. They passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, guaranteeing citizenship and voting rights. They established the Freedmen's Bureau to help formerly enslaved people, but Reconstruction ultimately failed when Northern political will collapsed and federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877. The Radical Republicans were right about needing strong federal protection for civil rights. History proved them correct when Jim Crow laws immediately reversed Reconstruction's gains, but being right doesn't guarantee success. Sometimes you're just decades early. And speaking of being early to adopt technology, the email that wasn't a message. 1971. Ray Tomlinson, a computer programmer working on ARPANET, the precursor to the internet, sent the first network email between two computers sitting side by side in his office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was testing the @type symbol as a way to separate the username from the computer name. The message he sent? QWERTY you up. Literally just the top row of letters on a keyboard. Or possibly testing 1, 2, 3, depending on which version of the story you believe. Tomlinson himself couldn't remember exactly because it seemed insignificant at the time. He was just testing. Didn't think he was making history. But that test became email, which became one of the primary forms of global communication. Billions of emails sent daily, spam, newsletters, work correspondence, the whole digital infrastructure. And it started with a programmer typing random letters to see if the * symbol worked. Sometimes world-changing inventions feel mundane in the moment, but while Tomlinson was inventing communication, others were opposing communication about the war. The Democrats who opposed the war, the Copperheads, Northern Democrats during the Civil War who opposed the war and wanted immediate peace negotiations with the Confederacy, called Copperheads by Republicans who compared them to venomous snakes. The Copperheads embraced the name, wore copper penny badges as identification. They weren't necessarily pro-slavery, though some were, but they opposed the war's continuation, the draft, Lincoln's expansion of federal power, and especially the Emancipation Proclamation. Strongest in the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, where support for the war was weaker. Their leader was Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham, who was arrested and exiled to the Confederacy in 1863 for giving anti-war speeches. He ran for Ohio governor from exile in Canada. Lost. Copperheads represented a significant portion of Northern Democrats, enough to worry Lincoln's re-election chances in 1864. But the war ended, the Union survived, and Copperheads became historical footnotes. Opposing the Civil War from the North was a losing position. politically and historically. But at least modern opposition doesn't require wearing snake imagery. And speaking of symbols that emerged from keyboards, the face that typed sideways September 1982, Carnegie Mellon University. Professor Scott Fahlman posted a message to a computer science bulletin board suggesting that jokes and serious statements should be marked with sideways faces made from punctuation marks. For humor, he proposed the colon, hyphen, and closing parenthesis. For serious statements, the reverse. This was the first documented use of an emoticon. Not invented by Fahlman, people had probably made smiley faces with typewriters before, but his was the first recorded proposal to standardize them for digital communication. And it worked. Emoticons spread across early internet communities, evolved into hundreds of variations, eventually became actual graphic emojis in the 2000s. Now we communicate more through tiny pictures than words sometimes. Entire conversations conducted in emoji. And it traces back to a computer science professor suggesting a way to indicate tone in text, because sarcasm doesn't translate well without facial expressions, and sometimes you need a sideways smiley face to avoid misunderstandings. But while modern communication was developing symbols, 19th century Democrats were developing increasingly specific factions. The Democrats who would burn barns, the barn burners. A faction of New York Democrats in the 1840s who opposed slavery's expansion into new territories. Called barn burners because their opponents said they were like farmers who'd burn down their own barn to get rid of rats, willing to destroy the Democratic Party to achieve their goals. The barn burners opposed the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and any compromise that allowed slavery to spread. Led by former President Martin Van Buren and his son, John. In 1848, the barn burners split from New York Democrats, joined the Free Soil Party, and ran Van Buren for president. He got 10% of the vote nationally. The split helped Whig candidate Zachary Taylor win. By the early 1850s, most barn burners reconciled with regular Democrats or joined the new Republican Party. But for a few years, New York Democrats were split between barn burners who prioritized stopping slavery's expansion and hunkers who prioritized party unity. Funny names, serious divisions. Slavery fractured every institution it touched. And speaking of fractured things, let's talk about what went to space. The emoji that left Earth, November 8, 1984. Space Shuttle Discovery launched on mission STS-51A. Standard retrieval mission, nothing particularly unusual. But the mission patch featured a stylized drawing that some people later identified as resembling a smiley face formed by the orbits and positioning of satellites. It wasn't intentionally an emoji. Mission patches are serious business designed by committees and NASA officials, but the design had circular elements and curved lines that, if you squint and want to see a face, kind of looked like one. Calling it the first emoji in space is a stretch. It's more like pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. We see faces in clouds, in toast, in mission patches. The actual first emoji were created by Shigetaka Kurita in Japan in 1999. But claiming STS-51A's patch as an emoji makes for a fun fact, even if it's more interpretation than intention. Space is serious. Smiley faces are not. The combination feels wrong but human. And speaking of human divisions, New York Democrats had another faction. The Democrats who hunkered down the hunkers, the other faction of New York Democrats in the 1840s, opposing the barn burners, called hunkers because they hunkered after political office, meaning they prioritized winning elections and distributing patronage over ideological purity. The hunkers were willing to compromise with Southern Democrats on slavery to maintain party unity and power. They supported the annexation of Texas, accepted the Mexican-American War, and opposed the Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery in territories acquired from Mexico, basically. They valued political success over anti-slavery principles. The Hunker-Barn-Burner split weakened New York Democrats throughout the late 1840s. They reunited in the early 1850s under the softshell and hardshell labels, which were somehow even worse names. New York Democratic factionalism was intense, confusing, and well documented because New York newspapers loved covering political infighting. The basic pattern: some Democrats opposed slavery's expansion, others prioritized party unity. Names got weird. American politics has always been fractious. We've just run out of good nicknames. And speaking of codes that organized American life, the zip code that came first, 1963. The U.S. Postal Service introduced zip codes, zone improvement plan codes, to make mail sorting faster and more efficient. Every address got a 5-digit code. The first zip code numerically, 00601. Adjuntas, Puerto Rico. Not the first code assigned, not the first area to use zip codes, just the first numerically. Adjuntas is a small mountain town in central Puerto Rico. Population around 18,000. And their zip code starts with 00 because Puerto Rico gets the 006 prefix, and Adjuntas comes first alphabetically among Puerto Rico municipalities or close to it. The numbering system starts on the East Coast, lower numbers, and moves west. Maine is 04, California is 9, Alaska is 99. Geographic logic, mostly. Before zip codes, postal workers sorted mail manually by memorizing addresses and routes. Zip codes made everything faster, allowed automation, enabled direct mail marketing, which means zip codes are why you get so much junk mail. Progress has costs, but at least your bills arrive efficiently. And speaking of number systems that organized communication, the softshells who softened positions, the softshell Democrats. After the Hunker-Barn-Burner split in New York partially healed in the early 1850s, the resulting factions were called softshells and hardshells. Softshells were former Hunkers and some barn-burners who accepted compromise on slavery issues, favored the Compromise of 1850, and generally tried to maintain national democratic unity. They were soft because they weren't rigidly pro-slavery or anti-slavery, just pragmatically focused on winning elections and avoiding party rupture. Softer positions, more flexible coalition building. They controlled New York Democratic politics through much of the 1850s, nominated candidates, distributed patronage. But as slavery tensions escalated toward the Civil War, being soft on the defining issue became untenable. You had to pick a side. By 1860, the softshell-hardshell distinction collapsed as national parties fractured completely. Sometimes moderation is a sustainable position. Sometimes the center cannot hold. The 1850s proved the latter. And while Democrats were debating positions, telephone companies were assigning codes. New Jersey's numeric claim, 1947. AT&T and Bell Labs developed the North American numbering plan, dividing the US and Canada into area codes to enable direct dial long-distance calling. Before this, you called an operator who manually connected your call. Area codes automated the process. The first area code assigned? 201, New Jersey. Not because New Jersey was first alphabetically or most important, but because of the rotary dial. High population areas got codes that were fastest to dial on rotary phones. Lower middle digit meant fewer clicks. New York City got 212. Los Angeles got 213. New Jersey got 201. The system prioritized efficiency over geography or pride. 201 still covers northeastern New Jersey. The area code system worked so well that it's still in use, though we've added hundreds more as phone numbers multiplied. Now we have area code pride, area code nostalgia, area code identity. 201 is New Jersey. 908 is also New Jersey. 732 is also New Jersey. They've subdivided, but 201 was first. And while some Democrats were making calls for moderation, the hardshells who wouldn't bend, the Hardshell Democrats, the other post-Hunker barnburner faction in New York opposing the softshells. Hardshells were more rigidly committed to defending slavery, opposing abolitionism, and rejecting any compromise that limited slavery's expansion. Hard because they wouldn't soften positions, wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't moderate. They represented the more conservative, pro-Southern faction of New York Democrats, less dominant than the softshells politically, but more ideologically consistent, which meant they were better at losing elections while maintaining principles. By the late 1850s, as the Democratic Party fractured nationally between Northern and Southern Democrats, hardshells found themselves aligned with Southern interests. When the Civil War began, some hardshells became Copperheads, opposing the war. Others joined the Union cause. The faction dissolved as war forced actual choices. Being hardshell about anything becomes difficult when reality demands decisions. But at least their commitment was clear, unlike the ambiguous symbols Americans plant in space. The Flag Code. Nobody follows U.S. Flag Code, established 1923, codified into federal law in 1942. Sets rules for flag display and handling, never touch the ground, never use for advertising, always fold into a triangle, dispose of worn flags by burning ceremoniously. Violation carries no penalty, it's advisory, not enforceable, protected by the First Amendment. But everyone quotes the never touch the ground rule, except when Apollo astronauts planted flags on the moon, those flags touched lunar regolith constantly during placement. Hard to plant a flag without the flag touching the surface you're planting it on. The astronauts did their best, but moon dust got everywhere. Flags fell over when lunar modules launched, and now they're all bleached white by solar radiation anyway. So the most famous American flags ever planted are all in violation of the Flag Code, assuming the Flag Code applies to celestial bodies, which it doesn't explicitly address. Sometimes symbols matter less than the moment. 6 flags on the moon, all technically incorrect, all historically perfect. And with that, we've reached 100 facts about American history that your textbook skipped. Sleep well. And that brings us to the end. 100 facts, from 1752 to now, from cracked bells to bleached flags on the moon, from presidents who wrestled to presidents who died after giving speeches that were simply too long. American history is stranger than anyone admits. It's full of contradictions and accidents and moments where someone made a decision that seemed insignificant at the time but changed everything. It's political parties with absurd names fighting over issues that felt life or death then and feel obscure now. It's technology that seemed impossible becoming mundane within a decade. It's flags that fade and symbols that shift and rules that nobody actually follows. So the next time you look at a history textbook and think you know the story, remember, there's always something weirder just beneath the surface. Someone invented the swivel chair while writing about freedom. Someone else bought Alaska for 2 cents an acre and got mocked for it. A presidential election was decided by people called mugwumps. The first email was literally just someone typing the top row of their keyboard. History is ridiculous. History is human. And history is full of people who are just trying to figure things out, same as you. Sleep well. Dream of flying 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk, or serving ice cream at an inaugural ball, or being president for exactly 1 day while completely asleep. And remember, at least you're not William Henry Harrison, standing in the rain for an hour and 45 minutes talking about ancient Rome. Good night.